If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Before we tuck into Tolkien and all that kind of stuff, I should absolutely recognize the fact that there are lots of people out there who've never read Tolkien. And it's not just that they haven't read Tolkien, they militantly don't want to read Tolkien. They despise everything about it, the dragons, the elves, and all that kind of stuff. So the question, I suppose, is he really that significant? And if so, why? So this is a history podcast, and so let's say right at the beginning, it's not a sort of Tolkien enthusiast podcast. It's absolutely aimed at people who love the books, but also people who have no intention of ever reading a single word. And the reason, the justification, is that Tolkien is a significant historical figure. And I think for two reasons. One, just very starkly, his book, The Lord of the Rings, is the single best-selling English language book of the 20th century, and therefore, presumably, probably in the world. That being said, I think there might be some Chinese contenders, but certainly in the West, The Lord of the Rings stands alone, really, by far the most successful book, probably the most influential if you went into any bookshop in Britain, America, Australia, and you could probably take out scores, if not hundreds of books that have been very, very clearly, directly influenced by Tolkien. And so the question is, why has it been so successful? My second reason is that Tolkien, he's obviously a historical figure. He's someone who was born in the 1890s, came of age just before the First World War, fought in the First World War at the Battle of the Somme, no less, and after that actually had a pretty quiet life, as we'll go on to discuss. But his books are a brilliant window, I think, into understanding the preoccupations and anxieties of what was going on in the late Victorian period all the way through to the Cold War. So anxieties about war, about technology, about industrialization, about the changes to landscape. So they're seen as prefiguring the environmental movement, for example. I mean, there's an awful lot there, and there are lots of threads there to unpick. And all of that without really, well, you know what? We actually don't need to talk about a single elf. If you're an elfophobe, don't worry. I think we will talk about elves because I would say there's a third reason why Tolkien is a valid and interesting subject to study. And that is, quite aside from the fact that he's a colossal British cultural icon. So I've talked about the Beatles, and I've talked about Ian Fleming. I've talked about Agatha Christie and George Orwell. They are all massive British cultural figures that have also had a global resonance. But Tolkien is far more than any of those. He is a major scholar of key aspects of history, specifically the languages of the early Middle Ages, of the German languages in particular, but also of the history. And so his perspective and his views on early medieval language and on the history of that period is also, I think, worth looking at. So I think that's the third reason. I mean, just to qualify that a little bit, or to actually just to amplify it, Tolkien is the single most important person to have ever written about Beowulf. In many ways, one of the founding documents of English literature and of the English language. Tolkien is the man who basically brought it into the limelight, into the sort of scholarly limelight. So, even if he'd never written or published a word about elves or Middle-earth and all that kind of stuff, he would still be remembered today by scholars as the man who had basically put Beowulf front and center. So that makes him interesting too, especially when you think this is the bloke who he rediscovered Beowulf, and this is also the bloke who fought at the Battle of the Somme. I mean, you could go further and say that certainly in the English-speaking world, Tolkien has probably had a greater influence on how the Middle Ages are popularly understood than anyone else in the 20th century. Actually, you could draw a line from Walter Scott through to Tolkien through to Game of Thrones. So Walter Scott, I would say, would be his only rival as someone who's influenced the popular understanding of what the Middle Ages were like. So I think for all those reasons, he's absolutely a valid subject of study for a history podcast. But I think precisely because he does kind of generate animus as well as devotion, it's probably worth our while just describing the kind of parabola of my relationship with him, which is actually very similar. I read him as a boy. I read The Hobbit first. I first encountered The Hobbit on TV, actually, on a show called Jackanory. And as soon as I say Jackanory, the actual theme tune comes directly to my head. And my overseas listeners won't know what that is, but it's a great TV show for kids that kind of highlighted books exactly like this. And then I read Lord of the Rings, certainly by the time I was about 10 or 11. And I think I was like a lot of people who read it at that age. You know, I was kind of a nerdy history kid, you know, kind of tucked up on my bed at boarding school in the middle of winter with a good book. I couldn't think of anything better. It became enshrined, you know, kind of right away in my mind as my best book, the best book that I'd ever read. And of course, you know, do I still think that? No, but it is probably still my sentimental favorite. You know, it would be my comfort read. And actually, I'd never thought about it as in a sort of a critical way at all until I think probably in my 20s when I read a great scholar called Tom Shipley, himself an amazing scholar of Anglo-Saxon works who succeeded to Tolkien's professorships at Oxford. And he basically wrote a couple of books, one which says Tolkien's work is all rooted in his scholarly study, in his study of languages. And I actually found that fascinating. And then he wrote a second book titled J.R.R. Tolkien, Author of the Century, where he was talking about Tolkien as a very specifically 20th century writer, as a writer of the world wars and of the age of modernism. And I found that absolutely fascinating. And since then, I've thought, you know, how odd is it that Tolkien actually suffers from the condescension of some of his academic posterity when he's so clearly a really, really interesting character and writer? I remember when Tolkien won I think it was the Waterstones to an end of century poll, and he won. I mean, he always wins those kind of polls by a canter. And Germaine Greer was quoted saying, "I have dreaded this moment. I knew this would happen." And I sort of thought, well, isn't it interesting then to say, well, why did it happen rather than just to bemoan it? I mean, the interesting question to me is why? And I think what I'll do in this podcast is go on to discuss that, but a little bit later on. With The Lord of the Rings, my father, his first job after the war was as a jet test pilot. And he was actually given a copy of Lord of the Rings by his stepfather. And he said that it was his go-to book. And then I read it again and again and again. And then I kind of cast it to the side as I would I suppose a bit of a childish thing that was very much my feeling at the time, especially as I was entering kind of my teens at boarding school. You know, I'd started to play rugby and hockey and soccer and every other sport you could imagine. And what you couldn't be at boarding school was a sportsman and a reader. If you tried that, the prefects would have definitely had their way with you. So I cast it aside and I didn't think about it anymore and felt faintly embarrassed about my childhood enthusiasm. But then I guess two things made me kind of reawaken my interest in it. And the first was taking history at O-level and then at A-level and writing about the early Middle Ages. So not just about the Vikings or about the Norse myths and things, which are obviously incredibly important to the fabric of Lord of the Rings, but also all kinds of historical episodes. You know, the siege of Constantinople, the siege of Augsburg, the Magyars, all this kind of stuff. But suddenly I understood where all these elements in Lord of the Rings were coming from, kind of like the mingling of different themes that you get, say, in T.S. Eliot's, you know, The Wasteland, another favorite of mine. I talked about Tolkien as kind of a 20th century author. I think there's a really strong element of that. And it's just that he's drawing on much, much more obscure reaches of history and language than, say, Eliot was or someone like that. And then when I started to lecture on the ships, and I would talk about the horrors of the Second World War and the Third Reich and all that kind of stuff, and I actually thought Tolkien would be perfect for that because, of course, he was a very devout Christian. He was a very devout Catholic. And I think that's a really, really important part, not just of how and why he comes to write what he does, but I think of his appeal. His books, once you see it, you can't then unsee it, if that makes sense. They have a kind of spiritual dimension to them. So as preparation for this podcast, I watched the 3 Lord of the Rings movies in succession, and I was actually stunned at how much I'd missed or misunderstood, and how clearly it holds a mirror up to the horrors of the mid-20th century in a really fascinating way. And I'm sure I'll come to that, but I'm rambling. But let's start with Tolkien the man. So my plan for those listeners who haven't deserted me already because they're terrified I'll talk of elves is that I'll talk about Tolkien and then we'll go on to talk about the books and the themes. And this is definitely a 2-podcast job. So gird your loins, we ride at daybreak. Or it should be 3. Should I do 3 episodes? It should be a trilogy. Although, Tolkien himself actually hated The Lord of the Rings being described as a trilogy because he believed it to be a single work. Anyway, we don't want to disappear into the nerdiness too soon. So yeah, let's start by talking about Tolkien. And funnily enough, for someone who believed himself to be an intensely English writer and whose dream was to create a mythology of and for England, he had a very German surname. So he's actually of Germanic stock. His ancestors actually came from Gdansk, well, on one side, his father's side, but his mother's side, Suffield, actually came from Evesham in the Midlands, and he loved that. And that was all about the fact that he'd come from ancient Mercia. But the other thing that's interesting is that he's not actually born in the Midlands, or indeed England. He is a son of empire, and he's born in South Africa in Bloemfontein in 1892. And his father, Arthur, is a very good Victorian, very, very telling name, with a sensational moustache, and of course he worked in a bank. I think it's fair to say a very unglamorous man, the banker of Rohan. I can't see it. So they had moved to South Africa. They got married in Cape Town and they had their honeymoon there. And then they settled in Bloemfontein, which Arthur absolutely loved and Mabel, his mother, absolutely hated. So he's christened John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. So when young Ronald is about 3, Mabel decides that she's going to go back to England. And by this stage, he's got a younger brother at this point as well, by the name of Hilary. So off they go to England. And the plan is that Arthur will join them when he's served out his notice from the bank. And that plan actually doesn't work out very well because he dies of rheumatic fever before he's able to board the ship. So suddenly, Mabel is back home in England, a widow, with these 2 very small boys. But what's important then for Tolkien's story, and indeed I think for the genesis of his fiction, is where they live, because they live in a place called Sharehold. So back when he moved there, it was a village in what was then North Worcestershire, on the fringes of Birmingham. Birmingham, the great Victorian city, the Joseph Chamberlain city, pumping out smoke, sees itself, as first city of the empire, a massive kind of urban leviathan, the din and the clash of industry, big wheels turning. And the 2 boys grow up in this little village where it has, a very pretty mill with a large water wheel, and there's little copses, where you can run and hide, and there's meadows and there's streams. And you know what? It's completely idyllic. But it's also obviously completely threatened and indeed doomed by the expansion of the city. It obviously has an absolutely seismic effect on Tolkien. And he claims that he remembers it coming to him because he also remembers being in South Africa. And it's the contrast that makes him fall in love with England, he says. Now, that may well be a bit of kind of, myth making, but there's no question that he feels very, very emotionally tied to the trees, to the mills, to everything that evokes the beauty of rural Warwickshire. And the fact that it is menaced by the encroachment of industry, I think that's highly important. And that's a big theme of English life, by the way, in the 1890s, 1900s. Lots of writers at the time actually wrote about this. So H.G. Wells is the classic example. He writes about what happens to Bromley in southeast London, swallowed up by the expanding city. And that's a big theme of Edwardian letters. But also the reason I think Tolkien has this incredibly sentimental attachment to the place, which is basically the prototype for the Shire, the place his hobbits come from in Lord of the Rings, I think is because he loses it before he's entered his teens. Because they move out of Surhole and they end up moving closer and closer to Birmingham. And then, shockingly, his mother dies when he's 12 years old. And there are two reasons why they move. One is because Tolkien's very, very bright, and he's going to King Edward's, so the absolute best grammar school in Birmingham, which is in the middle of Birmingham, so a long way for him to walk otherwise. So they have to move closer. But it's also because, and again, this is a key influence on Tolkien, his mother Mabel has converted to Catholicism, so they need to go to a Catholic church. And so that's the other reason why they move. And of course, she falls out with her family, who are Methodists. And so I think young Tolkien experiences this as a kind of, the fall. He goes on to say that every story is the fall. I think the idea is that everything is now a fall from grace, the loss of paradise. That's to become a really important part of his fiction. And I think that's this idea of a green and pleasant land, kind of threatened by industry and by the city, and a falling away from a sort of pre-lapsarian kind of state of grace. That is a very common theme of British writing in densely populated urban imperial society, industrial society at the turn of the 20th century. So he's orphaned by the time he's 12, and he and his brother become wards of a Catholic priest called Father Morgan. And they basically end up moving in with an aunt, and to give people a sense of life, anybody who knows Birmingham but doesn't know Tolkien, they basically move from the sort of England's green and pleasant land, woods and babbling brooks and things like that. They move to what is now very close to the busiest roundabout in the center of Birmingham. So this kind of huge clamor of noise and industry and factory and all of the above. I mean, as a kind of literary archetype, it's not just Edwardian, is it? I mean, this is actually, in my mind, it's Dickensian, it's Dickens. This is off to the blacking factory kind of level of trauma. And also, you have in Dickens the trauma of being orphaned, of adults as these really horrible, oppressive figures. And this is what happens to Tolkien. So the young Tolkiens go off to stay with their aunt, who is a very unsympathetic figure, and then they end up staying with another woman who's equally, I think, not maternal. And of course, these women sound tyrannical, kinds of Dickensian, kind of David Copperfieldish, but also lodged with the second of these rather tyrannical aunts is a girl called Edith Bratt, who is not a brat at all. She's actually very quiet. She's very calm. She's a very clever girl who's very, very good at the piano. And she's 3 years older than Tolkien. And they fall absolutely madly in love. But of course, the priest is not having any of this. He bans them from seeing each other, and they can't communicate for at least 3 years. I mean, what an absolutely extraordinary thing to do to teenagers. You wouldn't dream of doing that these days. But you know what? Here's the thing. Different times, different strokes, and Tolkien is actually quite a serious person at this stage. He's very intense. And I think that carries true throughout his life. He actually breaks the vow once, just once, to see her, to communicate with her. But otherwise, he absolutely adheres to the father's wishes. And I think the reason for that is partly because Father Francis has independent means and is helping to keep the boys. So Tolkien actually feels grateful for that, and he doesn't want to offend or upset him. And I think also he's a very, very devout Catholic and feels in a way, he's already getting into ideas of quests and romances, and this is taking up his time. He's passionately devoted to art theory and literature and all that kind of stuff. And I think he feels that this is a test that he and Edith absolutely have to go through. He's also quite idealistic. And in due course, he will actually mythologize their relationship, I think, to absolutely spectacular event. But what that does mean is that now that the girls have been, kind of parked to one side, he can actually focus on doing what good Edwardian chaps do, which is, play rugby and hang out with other chaps and talk about, scholarly things and things like that. So, of course, I mentioned that he went to King Edward's in Birmingham. This is a long-established, very famous, very prestigious private grammar school. And while he's there, he joins two organizations that really matter and will influence his life for forevermore. And if you want to read more about this, I read and hugely enjoyed the books by John Garth. He wrote a fantastic book about Tolkien and the Great War. And the Great War is not just about the Great War. It's also about Tolkien and the Edwardian period and the school that he goes to. And one of the things he does at the school is he joins the cadet force. So this is a very typically Edwardian thing. So Garth has found this amazing photo that actually shows Tolkien in 1907 at the age of 15. And he's looking very pale and very serious in his military uniform on the day that Field Marshal Lord Roberts, the great hero of the British Empire, the man who'd won endless victories, who'd won the Boer War, he comes to visit the school and all the boys are kind of lined up. And Tolkien is right there. And, these boys are actually being trained for war. The British government at this stage have a sense that war is coming and that Britain will be tested and that they will be tested. And everything they do at school is really preparing them for this. On the rugby field, the sense of, camaraderie, doing your bit, being part of the team, all this kind of stuff. Play up, play the game. Tolkien undoubtedly takes this very seriously. And I think the empire and the serving your country, the serving your king and country is actually a huge part of his worldview, even if that's an unconscious one. I think it could not be anything otherwise. And just a reminder, because Lord of the Rings ends up being, the toast of hippies in the 1960s. But, one of Tolkien's earliest, most vivid memories is of Surhole being lit up with bonfires and fireworks to celebrate Queen Victoria's Jubilee. And that will actually be fed into the opening of Lord of the Rings. So, he has a long life, and his roots in this pre-war society are really, really strong, really intense. But already as a 15-year-old, he's also starting to inhabit a very distant world. Of course, he trains on horseback, and he's not actually very good at that. But he's had experience of kind of, riding with cavalry. So that's something obviously that stays with him. And he's also doing Latin and Greek, as all boys of his age and class at grammar school would do. But he's also become obsessed by Germanic languages. And here's a really funny thing, they have a school play where everyone has to talk in Latin. So Edwardian. But Tolkien actually turns up and talks fluently in Gothic. Gothic. I mean, how precocious. He's 17 or something. And I think he actually gets into Gothic even before that, when he's even younger. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary because there's virtually nothing written in Gothic that remains. Loads of bits of it are just lost, and he becomes completely obsessed by it. And he's got this group of friends. They meet for tea, and they meet in a place called Barrow's Stores, which is actually in a department store. And it's a kind of a tea club in the Barrow's store. And they call themselves the TCBSs, the Tea Club Bavarian Society. And there's 4 key members, and Tolkien is one of them. And they are, when you read John Garth's book, and he produces, lots of their letters and so on. I mean, they're very, by adolescent standards, they're very intensely idealistic. Are they aesthetes? There is that bit about them, but they're not just aesthetes. So they're looking back to the world of the Norse and to the Anglo-Saxons and so on. And in that, they bear the imprints of the Victorians, I think, more than aesthetes. And actually, I think there's actually quite a bit of hostility to the idea of being an aesthete. So in due course, Tolkien will be a great enthusiast for, baggy tweed and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's a conscious kind of desire to have nothing to do with, that side of the ship. And also, Tolkien doesn't seem to be tremendously interested in women either. And I might come to that a little bit later. But if you think about it, women don't feature prominently in Lord of the Rings or indeed The Hobbit. They just don't. And I think the fact that he has Edith as, this great romantic object of devotion, she's incredibly important to him. But in a way, precisely because he's got that sort of his life sorted, he doesn't worry about women so much. And he can now actually focus on just hanging out with the chaps. And that kind of very intense masculine camaraderie, which is a very Edwardian thing, isn't it? And he buys into that hugely. And so in due course, he gets a scholarship to go to Oxford and attends Exeter College. And there are two people who I think are excellent kind of precursors for Tolkien. So one of them is the very famous William Morris, the great Victorian polymath. And of course, Morris is the person who really makes the Icelandic sagas and things like that trendy for idealistic, younger people in the decades that follow. So in other words, of Tolkien's generation. The other person who also went to King Edward's is the painter Edward Burne-Jones. And he's obsessed with, the medieval, with King Arthur and all that kind of stuff. And that idea of a group of devoted to high-minded medievalism is absolutely something that Tolkien and his friends buy into. So it's more than a hobby for these guys, the tea, the meeting up. It's a very common thing in late Victorian Edwardianism, British culture, this revulsion from industry and from the machine age and from urban modernity and this sort of idealization of a lost world of knights and, paladins and maidens. I mean, you see that everywhere in late Victorian culture, an incredibly intense experience of friendship. So two of his friends go to Oxford, including Tolkien, and two of them go to Cambridge. And what they do is they meet up at regular intervals. So one of them's a poet, and Tolkien is actually thinking of becoming a philologist. One of them's a painter, and one of them's a musician. And they all take themselves very, very seriously. And the fact that they're all equally take themselves seriously, and they all sustain each other in that sense, in what they're doing, is incredibly important for this group. I mean, this is the thing that astounds me. They're 19 years old and they haven't done anything. All they've done is write poems to, read at their weekly meetings. But to them, everything they write is sort of loaded with this sort of cosmological importance. And Tolkien is already writing some of the stuff I think that we will see later. So in 1914, he writes the first, what looks now like the first fragment of this great corpus of legends. And I actually have it in the Old English because, of course, he wrote it in the Old English. So I'll give this a stab for you. So this is Cyniwulf, called Christ. Ayala, Erendel, Engla, Bertast, offer mitten God, mommen sended. So what that means is, that's Hail Erendel, brightest of angels over Middle-earth. You have been sent to mankind, to men. So that's actually not Tolkien. He didn't produce that. That's Anglo-Saxon. But the question is, what is Erendel? And why is Tolkien pondering this in 1914? And he actually wrote about it as a piece of fiction that he published much later. But he says, I felt a curious thrill. So reading those lines, I felt a curious thrill as if something had stirred within me, half wakened from sleep. There was something very remote and strange and beautiful behind those words, if I could grasp it far beyond ancient English. And of course, that question of who or what Erendel is haunts him. And at one level, of course, it's Christ. But at another level, maybe it's the morning star or the evening star. It's the star that actually enables navigators to follow as they sail out into the Atlantic. And so he writes his poem in which Arundel is a mariner who's setting out across the ocean rather as the Irish saints had once done. And I honestly think if history had played out differently, I wouldn't be doing this podcast and this poem would be utterly forgotten. But that very summer, that's the summer of the assassination in Sarajevo, of the slide to war. It's the First World War, and what happens next to Tolkien that completely, it doesn't change his trajectory, but it gives it a charge for it that it wouldn't otherwise have had. And it's that, I think, that is the defining and the seismic moment in his life. And I think it's that we should come to after this break. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So I'm talking about the life and times of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I've got as far as the First World War. So Tolkien's instinct when war breaks out, interestingly, is not to rush to the battlefront because he's very conscious that he wants an academic career and he doesn't want to rush off and jeopardize that and not graduate and not get the qualifications that he needs. So he leaves it a year or so and he starts to get hints from his relatives that he really should be joining up. You know, we've noticed everyone else is at war. Why are you not there? You know, what are you doing? But he does basically sign up, but he can actually put it on hold. So there's no question that once he's finished his degree, he will go. So he gets his degree, he gets a very good first, which means that he will be able to pursue an academic career should he survive the conflict. But in 1915, he is commissioned. He joins the signals, and among all the other skills that he learns as a signal officer, he learns to handle pigeons. I mean, if you think about Lord of the Rings, there's quite a lot of birds. I mean, there's birds everywhere. No pigeons, mind you, but there's lots of eagles. So he joins the 11th Lancashire Fusiliers because his friend has, Christopher Wiseman, one of the TCBSs. So all his friends have effectively joined up, the whole little group of them. And they believe in the war as a slightly idealistic crusade. They believe that a new Britain will be created at the end of the war, and they believe wholeheartedly that it's their responsibility to do it. So Tolkien and co. get posted to France. His battalion in the summer of 1916 arrives just in time for the big push. The show that is being planned near Aubert turns out to be the Battle of the Somme. And look, he's not there on the first day, but one of his friends, Robert Gilson, is, and he's killed on the first day of the Somme. He's one of the 19,240 British soldiers who were killed on that very first day, making it the bloodiest day in British history. There were an additional 38,000 wounded, making the total casualties for one day 57,470. And then Tolkien himself is inevitably drawn into the horror. And in John Garth's book, which I was talking to you about a little bit earlier on, he actually describes it as this. They're going into the trenches littered with bodies, body parts at every step, the mud, the rain, the horror. And for a young man, for an idealistic young man who's basically, spent far too much time reading, Finnish grammar books, this must have been an absolutely searing and indeed life-defining experience. And he has, he's at the cutting edge of a number of seismic developments in the history of warfare that will have obvious echoes for anyone who has read his novels or seen the films. So he's actually there on the 15th of September for the debut of the tank. And tanks, when you think of the great battering rams and the dragons and all the huge elephants in his stories, that's something. But he is also there while the Red Baron is doing his stuff in the air overhead. So the Red Baron, who's a German, is becoming the greatest fighter ace of the air. And basically, he enables the German Air Force to win control of the battlefield. So that sense that there is danger in the air, which again is something that you get throughout Tolkien's fiction, the sense that danger lurks there. And in due course, of course, it's not planes, but witch kings on pterosauruses is what he actually conjures up. And I think it's pretty clear that the inspiration for that sense of terror isn't coming from medieval literature. It's clearly coming from his personal experiences in the trenches. And Tolkien said later about this that the war made me pointedly aware of the beauty of the world. I remember miles and miles of seeing tortured earth. Now, they're perhaps best described in the chapter about the approaches to Mordor in Lord of the Rings. So I think that sense of the earth being tortured, which had been floating there really ever since, since he moved to Birmingham, is enhanced massively by the spectacle of what the horrors of war are actually doing to him. So there's a chapter in Lord of the Rings called The Dead Marshes. And the heroes, Frodo and Sam, they kind of see swamps that are full of dead bodies lying just below the surface as they're walking through it. And you know what? Obviously, that clearly comes from his experience, from an experience of somebody who was on the Western Front in 1916, who saw the fields, the puddles, the gullies, the trenches littered with German and British bodies. And actually, Tolkien once said in an interview that the real theme of Lord of the Rings was death. And you can understand why, because if you look at the figures, from his school, from King Edward's, 243 boys were killed in the First World War from that school. From his Oxford College, Exeter, 141 young men were killed in the First World War. And Tolkien himself could easily have been killed, but he was just incredibly fortunate. I mean, it's weird to say it because he actually contracts a disease which could conceivably have killed him, which is called trench fever, which you actually get from lice. So what happens is, you're bitten by the lice because lice were everywhere in the trenches. You couldn't escape them. And what happens is you get this kind of severe flu. It's not a flu. And before I get doctors kind of sending me messages in, I know it's not a flu, but the symptoms are very much the same. And anyway, he's invalided out. And basically his war is kind of over from that point. So he's invalided out in the autumn of 1916, and then he spends the rest of the time recuperating. Oh, I forgot to mention, sorry, he marries Edith. They actually became engaged in 1914, just before the war, and she then converted to Catholicism. And that was actually a non-negotiable thing as far as Tolkien was concerned. She had to become a Catholic. And I think it's a sign of his intense piety that he takes it so seriously. And she is absolutely devoted to him, so devoted that she will risk the displeasure of her own family by actually doing it. And so she's married him just before he goes, and then she follows him around. So she's pregnant, and then she has a child, and she falls pregnant again. So it's really tough for her as he's moved from hospital to hospital and then from post to post, because every time he seems to be recovering, he actually relapses again. And there is a key moment when he's at a place called Roos, which is just south of the Humber. And there's a wood. And he goes with Edith into this wood. And it's spring, and it's spectacularly beautiful. And he's still haunted by the prospect that he will probably have to go back to the front at some stage, because it's still only 1917. But it's this beautiful English spring. It's everything that he would ever dream of. And Edith lovingly dances for him. And he clings to the memory of this. And he then constructs a story about mortal Beren and an elf, an elvish princess, Luthien. And of course, elves are immortal. And it's about the love between the mortal and the immortal. And in due course, the immortal abandons her immortality, and they marry, and they have a very short life together. And this is a story that Tolkien writes again and again and again, over the course of his life. And when in due course they die, on the tombstone, Tolkien describes himself as Beren and Edith as Luthien. And this is actually immortalized in the story that he wrote called The Silmarillion. And it's obviously it's the story that more than any other is the wellspring of Tolkien's emotional life. And it's framed in these ancient languages, these ancient epics. But it's clearly also massively bred of the war, and Tolkien as the person who will probably die. I mean, it's so painful. It's the kind of thing people would imagine people sniggering at or sneering at. But actually, it's very moving when you read, the way he writes about it and the fact that it's chiseled on their tombstones. I mean, it's incredible. It obviously means an enormous amount, you would assume, to him, but also to her. I would say it's the emotional heart. I mean, because it's also something that then reappears in Lord of the Rings with Aragorn. We are conscious of it as a story. And of course, if you don't know Lord of the Rings, Arwen is an elf who's immortal and Aragorn is mortal. So it's obviously this idea of a man who is doomed to die in love with someone who will be immortal. It's absolutely the heart of it. Anyway, Tolkien doesn't die. And it's about this point that he's scribbling away at various different stories. Not the stories that most people will now associate with Tolkien, the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. He's creating this world of legends, these myths and folk tales and so on. He's scribbling, as he says himself, in huts full of blasphemy and smut. So in other words, in these sort of jerry-built huts where, he's recuperating and soldiers are recuperating, and he's scribbling on, odd bits of paper, the sort of stories that he was thinking about before the war, except now they are laden with doom. And there's this sort of preoccupation with death and with immortality and with cities that are doomed. So the first story he writes is called The Fall of Gondolin in 1917, which you can actually buy now as an independent story. And it's about a city that is attacked by these great kind of mechanical dragons and falls inevitably. And there's this sort of pessimism and sort of despair at the heart of this story. This is a response to the First World War. And of course, you wouldn't have got it without William Morris and, the High Victorians and the sort of medievalism of that period. But you also wouldn't have got it, I think, without the experience of Tolkien being in the trenches on the Western Front. And it's the first piece of writing where you can actually see the horrors of mechanized warfare being recalibrated and given the appearance of dragons and balrogs and all these kinds of, monsters that he creates. It's very, very powerful. But I think also the appeal that he has held, certainly for English readers, is that he is consciously trying to fill what he sees as a gap. So he's reading enormous amounts of Finnish literature in Finnish. And, he's incredibly impressed by the antiquity of these Finnish tales. And he reads Norse epics, Icelandic epics. And again, he's very, very impressed at the way that these ancient stories and legends have actually survived. But what he's terribly upset about is that England actually doesn't have anything that's comparable. Perhaps Beowulf, perhaps a few other poems, but not much else. And he then blames the Norman conquest for this. So in 1066, isn't it always the French who are the villains? With the English, it's always the French. I often wonder, just to segue a little bit, I wonder if the French sit there and say it's always the English. I wonder if that animosity actually comes from their side as well as from the English side. So he has this very kind of dogmatic opinion. So he's very keen on Finnish, but he hates French. He goes to Paris and he complains about the vulgarity and the jabber and the spitting and the indecency. But he goes on about the Norman conquest in that way that, people who are upset about Britain leaving the EU go on about, the Brexit vote. It's the great trauma, the great horror. And he experiences it as vividly and as viscerally as someone today might, lament about Brexit. And so he sets himself the task of reconstructing the legends and the stories that England might have had. And I think it's incredibly important to say that he doesn't do it from nowhere. So he's not making this up. He's so immersed in the languages and the history of language that what he's doing is he's picking up these tiny fragments, these tiny hints of history, and he's putting them together and recreating it. And so that's where Arundel, that poem that I read to you in Old English comes from. That for Tolkien, it's the language that comes first, and then he has to decide, what do these words actually mean? What do these names actually mean? Where are they coming from? And that becomes his kind of great mission. And his particular feeling is that it's not just that England has lost its mythology, but it's also that England is, and I think to a degree that probably most people would find visible, except that Tolkien believes and feels it so strongly that he has indeed achieved, what he actually sets out to do, which is astonishing. He creates this mythology. But he also feels incredibly seriously that England and Wales was sacred to a kind of people who haunt the mythologies of the North. This idea that there were people who lived in these lands that were somehow higher than mortal humans, to whom originally he actually gave the name gnomes. And the garden gnome actually wasn't invented until the late 1930s. So when Tolkien first calls them gnomes, it's actually not a ludicrous name. But now, of course, it seems very funny. I mean, now it's completely ludicrous that he calls them gnomes. But they are basically the elves of his stories. And there's an element of the angel in the elves, don't you think? But this is interesting because in medieval literature and the Norse literature, elves are actually much more ambivalent figures. They're actually rather dangerous. They're quite dark, aren't they? Well, they can be quite dark. So in Norse sorcery and Viking sorcery, elves are kind of a part of this strange world that includes dwarves that live beyond the limits of the human in the Viking world. So his elves are clearly coming from that. And what Tolkien hates about the role that elves and fairies and all that kind of stuff plays in England at this particular time is that they've been prettified and kind of diminished. And now they're kids' figures. The kind of thing that, Arthur Conan Doyle, remember there was the picture of the girls and the fairies that were actually, kind of fabricated in the garden. And Tolkien hates it. He hates all that kind of stuff. And what he wants to do is kind of revive what they were meant to be. And he comes to feel basically that England was the great home of elves. And look, I know I can hear people who hate Tolkien laughing at this, but he's coming out of the war. And I think it matters terribly to him. And that the measure of how deeply he feels, this is precisely the kind of emotional heft that this world comes to carry. Not just for Tolkien, but for millions of people, not just living in England either, but across the world. And the thing about myth and the obsession with myth, with legend, with kind of folktales, it's not just a legacy of the kind of late Victorian period, but also you see it everywhere in interwar culture, don't you? Now, to some listeners, it will seem almost blasphemous to put Tolkien with these writers. But let's just think about writers like William Butler Yeats in Ireland, or indeed James Joyce, who's fascinated by myths and legend, who's thinking of new ways of working on them, or as T.S. Eliot, another amazing writer. And of course, I mentioned T.S. Eliot before. Somebody who's coming out of the First World War is thinking about picking up fragments from their sort of shattered remains of Western civilization to try to make something new. Tolkien might seem a million miles away, but I think there are definite kinds of correspondences there. And even if you hate Tolkien, he's clearly part of the same milieu. So maybe come to Eliot later when I look at the experience of the Second World War, because I think they're really interesting and perhaps overt parallels there. But just on the topic of Joyce, I'd say Ulysses is as different a novel as you can imagine to Lord of the Rings, except that both of them, both Joyce and Tolkien, in their unbelievably different ways, are obsessed by language. So Tolkien, at the end of the war, gets a job working on the new Oxford Dictionary. So he becomes a lexicographer, and he does everything associated with WA. And then he gets a job in Leeds University. And of course, then he gets a job at Oxford. And this is the famous Rawlinson and Bosworth professorship. And basically, from that point on, he stays at Oxford. And what's really interesting is that Humphrey Carpenter's biography of Tolkien at this point says that his life stops being interesting. And I think what he means by that is that he ends up leading the life of an Oxford Don. which is a completely uninteresting life. But all this time, Tolkien is thinking about language, and he's absolutely obsessed by it. So if you wanted to compare, say, a chapter from Lord of the Rings with a chapter from Ulysses, you could actually do it. You could do it. So there is a chapter in Ulysses that has a Cyclops. It's Leopold Bloom, the hero of Ulysses. And he meets with an Irish nationalist in a pub, and the Irish nationalist throws a glass at him and Bloom leaves. And that's basically the plot. But the whole thing is couched through various forms of English, starting from the earliest form of Old English and going right the way up to the present day. And I love this. Joyce is actually fascinated by the way in which English as a language evolves, and he makes play with this throughout the entire chapter. In Lord of the Rings, Tolkien has this chapter called the Council of Elrond, and it's where the various peoples from, different parts of Middle-earth actually come and meet. And again, you can exactly gauge the kind of how ancient a people they are by the kind of English that Tolkien makes them use. So the hobbits, they're representatives of 1920s England. They speak in a very contemporary form of English. But of course, then you have the men, you have the dwarves, and you have the elves. And they all come from different periods of history. And they all have subtly different forms of English, subtly different forms of vocabulary. And I think that the parallels, perhaps, I think it's a very intriguing one. And the way in which both Joyce and Tolkien, in their very, very different ways, are using language to express quite important truths, I think, about the instability of things. Because if language is constantly evolving, then it means that people can be left behind. And that's interesting, isn't it? But I think the difference is that Joyce is well known in the 1920s. I mean, not the difference, it's a difference. And Tolkien is completely and utterly obscure at this stage. So all the work he's doing on his languages and this sort of imagined worlds and things, it's a bit like the equivalent of a train set in the attic. He does it when he comes home. And you can imagine Edith saying, what are we doing tonight? And he says, well, I'm writing about the gnomes again. It's very highbrow kinds of battle reenacting, isn't it? It's kind of like dressing up in the Civil War uniform or something. And he takes it tremendously seriously. And then he meets a new friend in 1926 called C.S. Lewis, who was a like-minded man who also lost all of his friends in the First World War. And Tolkien has this really tragic line, that he writes later, that by 1918, I had lost all but one of my closest friends. So he's got one left, and he doesn't actually see him very much or get on with him very much at all anymore. And he's a Methodist headmaster. So Tolkien's there in Oxford, and he meets this big Ulsterman, called C.S. Lewis, who obviously went to a very good school. He's very well educated. And Lewis is also interested in language too. And he's interested in Norse myths. He's interested in Anglo-Saxons and all of that kind of stuff that, really kind of fires Tolkien. And they meet and they go to a pub and they read each other's stuff and they have a tremendous time. Tolkien, there's no reason to think he's ever going to be, apart from his academic work and his interest in Beowulf and these kind of things, there's no reason to think that he's actually ever going to be any kind of public figure of any kind whatsoever. And then there's the famous story that is basically, because he's not very well paid, he's relatively hard up and he's marking school certificate exam papers in the summer. And the story goes, I think it's about 1930, one day he's completely bored. You can imagine the scene, mid-afternoon, another paper, and there's a blank page in one of his scripts, and what he scribbles will change the world. And it gives me goosebumps just reading it now. He scribbles, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And then he doesn't know what to do with it. He knows it's the beginning of something very important, but he doesn't know what. Well, what a note. What a note. And you know what, folks? I'm actually going to draw a line there under today's episode and come back to it in our next episode where I'll look at The Hobbit and I'll look at the rings. And I will look at elves. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.